Hearing my own daughter say she did not think I would take it personally was a bitter pill to swallow. Those were the words Emily used after I found out I was not invited to her wedding. No personal call, no elegant invite, not even a text. I only found out because a former coworker sent me a Facebook screenshot while I was sitting alone in my kitchen eating reheated meatloaf. In the photo, she wore a white gown and veil, holding a bouquet and wearing a smile I had spent my entire life trying to protect. Beside her stood Brandon, a man I had met only 4 times. Underneath the caption read, "Best day of our lives." I stared at my screen, then at the calendar on the fridge. The wedding was this Saturday, just 3 days away, and I was not invited. At 70 years old, I thought I had already survived the hardest things life could throw at me. I buried my wife, worked through physical pain, spent winters climbing frozen utility poles, and watched good friends die far too young. But nothing prepares a father for the realization that he is no longer considered family. My name is Frank Dawson, and I live in a quiet town outside Columbus, Ohio. For 34 years, I worked as a union electrician. It is the kind of job that leaves your knees aching before 50, where your hands never quite straighten out again. You give up pieces of your body, convincing yourself it is worth the sacrifice because you are building a future for your child. For me, that was Emily. She was only 12 when her mother died of breast cancer. We were planning a family vacation one spring, and 6 months later, I stood by a fresh grave, wondering how to raise my little girl alone. I was far from perfect. I burned dinners, forgot permission slips, and arrived late to ballet recitals because I was stuck working overtime. But I tried with every ounce of my soul. I packed her lunches before dawn, helped with homework after 10-hour shifts, and sat through school concerts and soccer games when I could barely keep my eyes open. Every decision I made back then revolved around one simple question. What does Emily need? I never once asked what Frank needed because that felt selfish. Years flew by. Emily grew up, went to college, earned her degree, and eventually took a marketing job in Columbus, moving into her own downtown apartment. Seeing her build her own life made me prouder than I had ever been of anything. Even after she moved out of my house, I kept helping her whenever she hit a rough patch. If her car broke down or a medical bill popped up, I gladly covered it. It was just the normal support a father offers. But about 6 years ago, she called me in tears because her rent had jumped and she was drowning financially. I promised to help her out temporarily until she found her footing. That word temporary was supposed to be the key. Instead, months dragged into years and the bank transfers simply continued. Sometimes it was $300, other times $500. I never complained because she kept saying things would improve, and I believed her. We parents believe what we want to be true, don't we? Waiting a few hours to calm down, I finally dialed Emily's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice immediately sounding tight and nervous as she greeted me. I quietly told her I had seen the wedding pictures. A heavy silence filled the line, followed by a long, defeated sigh. She just said, "Oh." It was a single, flat word, showing no surprise. Only the realization that her secret was out. When I asked if my invite had been lost in the mail, she quietly admitted there never was one. I leaned back, my old wooden chair creaking beneath me as she claimed it was Brandon's idea to keep the event small. A bitter laugh escaped my chest. I pointed out that I counted 93 people in those ceremony photos, but she offered no reply. I began listing the guests, pointing out that her cousin Linda was there. Silence. I noted that her old high school volleyball coach attended. More silence. I even brought up the 3 coworkers from Brandon's office, but she said nothing until she finally blurted out that they wanted people who were actively involved in their lives. Those words cut deep. Actively involved. I thought about every grueling overtime shift, every middle-of-the-night emergency, every rent payment, and every sacrifice I had made. I swallowed hard and said I understood. But then she told me not to make this into something bigger than it is. That sentence broke my heart, because to her this was a minor detail, but to me, it was everything. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen for an hour, the house feeling colder. While people always complain about the physical pains of getting older, like bad knees, or the pills lined up by the coffee pot nobody warns you about becoming invisible, nobody tells you that the people you built your entire life around might one day decide you are no longer necessary. Later that evening, my phone rang. It was Carl, my old friend, who is a 72-year-old retired firefighter and fellow widower. He asked if I was okay, and I told him no. When I finished explaining everything, he was quiet for a second before telling me to stop auditioning for a role I had already earned. I asked him what he meant, and he said that I am her father, not an applicant. Those words pierced right through me. Carl's advice hit me hard because I knew deep down he was right. For years, I had been trying to earn appreciation that should have existed naturally, always giving more, paying more, and hoping it would finally be enough. It never was. That night, instead of wallowing in self-pity, I opened my laptop and searched for flights. By the next morning, I booked a trip to Hawaii. If my daughter did not want me at her wedding, I was not going to spend that day staring at my living room wall. 3 days later, while she walked down the aisle, I stood barefoot on a Maui beach. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant orange and gold, and as the waves rolled against the shore, I realized that, for the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. Nobody wanted my money, no one needed my advice on that beach, and no one expected me to rescue them. It was just the ocean, the wind, and the silence. As I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I asked myself a question I should have asked years ago. What would happen if I stopped trying to save everyone and finally chose myself? The answer was coming, though I did not know it yet. The funny thing about growing old is how peace changes. In my youth, it meant having money in the bank. In middle age, it was knowing my daughter was safe. By 70, peace meant waking up without someone needing something from me. For one glorious week in Hawaii, staying at a modest beachfront hotel in Maui, that is exactly what I had. It was a modest place, the kind of hotel retirees choose because they value real experiences over pointless luxury. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, since old habits die hard. After 40 years of getting up before dawn from my electrical work, retirement could not rewrite my body clock. I would pour a cup of coffee and walk the shoreline as the sky slowly brightened. Most of the people I met were my age, like retired teachers, veterans, and grandparents with decades of stories in their faces. One morning, I struck up a conversation with a retired Marine named Walter, who was close to 80 years old. He walked with a cane, but still carried himself like he was inspecting troops. We sat down together on a bench overlooking the water. Our conversation eventually turned to why I was traveling alone, and I told him the truth. I did not give him every detail, just enough. I mentioned that my daughter got married this week, and when he congratulated me, I added that I was not invited. Walter stared at the ocean for several seconds before nodding and saying that would leave a mark. That old-fashioned phrase made me smile. I admitted that it did. He tapped his cane and asked what I thought he had learned after Vietnam. When I asked, he said that people eventually reveal how much they value you, and our mistake is refusing to believe them. Those words stayed with me. The rest of my vacation felt different, not necessarily sad, but deeply reflective as I looked back over my life. Looking back, the strangest part of those early days was that I was not even angry with Emily yet. Mostly, I just felt a profound disappointment that our relationship had become entirely transactional. I gave, she received, and we repeated that cycle year after year without either of us questioning it. One afternoon, I watched humpback whales in the distance, while a young couple nearby argued over the cost of an excursion. It was normal life stuff, but as I listened, a truth hit me. Those two were making joint decisions, accepting consequences, and building a life together. Meanwhile, my daughter and her new husband seemed to be planning their entire future on the lazy assumption that I would always step in to cover whatever financial gap appeared. That realization stung. That specific thought ended up troubling me far more than the wedding itself. Weddings are driven by raw emotion, but financial dependence is a deliberate choice. A week later, I boarded my flight back home to Ohio. The moment we landed and I turned off airplane mode, my phone went off like crazy. Notifications flooded the screen with missed calls, voicemails, and urgent text messages, more than I had received in months. My stomach tightened in fear of some emergency. I checked the names and saw they were all from Emily and Brandon. I had 17 missed calls, 6 voicemails, and over 20 texts. The first few messages just said, "Dad, call me, and please call me as soon as possible." But the later ones grew frantic, finally revealing the real panic. Their rent was overdue, My phone buzzed in my hand, displaying a message that went straight to the point. "Did you transfer the money?" Emily was demanding an answer, but before I could even process that, a follow-up text from her husband, Brandon, popped up. He wrote, "Frank, we really need to talk." I had to chuckle at that. Not dad, not family, just Frank. How telling. I sat there in the crowded airport terminal, slowly scrolling through days of increasingly desperate messages. Once I got home, I ignored their calls to give myself space to process everything. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with my retirement notebook, I decided to look at the numbers. I pulled up 6 years of bank statements, noting transfer after transfer, month after month. The final sum shocked even me. Once I finished adding up all those monthly transactions, I realized the total amount of money was enough to buy a couple of reliable used cars. It was a cold splash of reality. This financial arrangement was never going to be temporary for them, even though that was the original promise. It had quietly transformed into a permanent line item in their monthly budget, a baseline expectation for their lifestyle. The following morning, my phone rang with Emily's name on the screen, and I finally picked up. She did not ask about my trip to Hawaii or the wedding, she just let out a sigh of relief. When she complained that their rent payment failed and they got a landlord notice, I just stayed completely silent. She demanded to know why I had not transferred the funds, and the entitlement in her voice hung heavily in the air. She did not ask if I was able to help. She simply treated my bank account as a hard obligation. I looked around my quiet kitchen, the very room where I had packed thousands of school lunches, helped her solve algebra equations, and wept bitter tears after her mother passed away. A sudden wave of clarity washed over me. I was no longer a father being asked for a favor, I was a service provider being billed. I asked her when this had officially become my responsibility. Her immediate irritation spoke volumes, reminding me that she did not feel gratitude anymore, only expectation. There is a world of difference between a grateful child and an expectant debtor. I reminded her of how this agreement had started, pointing out that it was always meant to be a temporary fix. Emily sighed dramatically, insisting it was not the time for this talk, but I firmly disagreed. In the background, I could hear Brandon murmuring impatiently, his voice muffled but clearly annoyed. She lowered her voice to ask if we could just handle the rent now and talk later. That was the final straw. For 70 years, I had strived to be a dependable provider, a father who sacrificed everything. But I finally understood that my financial support was no longer helping them, it was simply enabling them. I sent her a single message that would change the dynamics of our family forever. I wrote that help is a generous gift, not a lifetime contract. Her furious replies started flooding in within 30 seconds, demanding to know if I was serious, and accusing me of acting out because of their wedding. I set my phone face down on the table, refusing to engage. For the first time in my 70 years, I did not rush to fix their mistakes or transfer a single dollar. A heavy weight seemed to lift from my shoulders. I knew they were going to be absolutely furious with me, but I realized that their anger was no longer my responsibility. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. Eventually, the hostile text messages dwindled, and my phone stopped ringing every hour. I was no longer living in constant anticipation of their next self-inflicted financial disaster. Honestly, I expected to feel some level of parental guilt because we are wired to worry about our children no matter how old they get or how much they hurt us. Yet that expected guilt never arrived. Instead, I was met with absolute clarity, the kind that only comes when you have lived long enough to recognize repetitive cycles. A week later, I watched Emily pull into my driveway shortly after lunch. She looked exhausted and emotionally drained as she stepped out of her car carrying a weight I knew all too well. It is amazing how quickly life can age you when your unpaid debts finally come due. I opened the front door before she even had a chance to knock on the wood. We greeted each other quietly, but a massive emotional chasm felt wider than the short distance between us. She stepped into the warm entryway, where the comforting scent of morning coffee lingered, and a baseball game murmured on the television. She looked around the living room as if trying to reconnect with her roots. This was the house where she grew up, the home I struggled to keep after her mother passed, and the place I nearly lost twice during hard economic times. We sat down across from each other in heavy, thick silence. She was the one to finally break our silence by mentioning that Brandon was deeply upset. I had to restrain a grim smile, noticing how she prioritized his feelings over her own. When she accused me of trying to punish them, I simply shook my head and leaned back in my chair. She asked why I had chosen this exact moment to stop helping, revealing once again her deep assumption that my support was a permanent right. I took a deep breath and asked her if she had any idea how long I had been paying a portion of their rent. She guessed she did not know, so I told her it had been 6 long years. Her eyes widened in surprise as the weight of that number finally hung in the quiet room. Before my recent trip to Hawaii, I had never sat down to add up all those payments. It is easier to avoid the cold math when the numbers tell a story you would rather not face. Emily stared down at the floor, offering the weak excuse that things had just gotten complicated. For once, she had no real justification. She left later that evening without starting another fight, clearly frustrated but also deeply contemplative. Brandon, however, had no interest in self-reflection. 2 days later, my phone rang with his number, and curiosity got the better of me. He called me Frank, once again stripped of any familial respect, and demanded that we talk, in a tone that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. His attitude was not openly hostile, but it carried a jarring sense of pure entitlement. He sounded like a corporate manager calling an underperforming employee in for a tense performance review. He kept talking about Emily being upset, and how the unpaid rent was causing major issues, but I refused to feed into his energy. When he snapped and demanded to know if I was even listening, I looked out the window at a pair of birds in the yard envying their simple lives. I asked him what he expected me to say, and he replied that I could start by helping. There was no apology or accountability in his voice, only demands. I hung up shortly after, knowing the call was entirely useless. The call made one thing abundantly clear. Brandon truly believed that I was obligated to fund their lifestyle. Over the next couple of months, local gossip in our small Ohio town began to trickle my way. People talk in tight-knit communities, and a former colleague mentioned seeing Brandon arguing with a banker, while someone else noticed his beloved truck was suddenly up for sale. I tried to ignore the whispers until Emily called me out of the blue. Her voice had lost its usual defensive edge and sounded completely defeated. She hesitantly asked if I had any idea about the massive credit card debt Brandon had accumulated, and I had to tell her that I was completely in the dark. She had been kept in the dark about his spending habits as well. Over our hour-long conversation, the devastating truth about their finances slowly unraveled. Their lavish wedding, the tropical honeymoon, their fancy new furniture, and multiple vacations had all been funded by high-interest credit cards. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces fell into place. My hard-earned rent money had not been keeping them afloat. It had simply been subsidizing a hollow, wealthy illusion. I felt a deep sadness for my daughter, not because of the lost cash, but because discovering your spouse has a secret life of debt is a devastating betrayal. That night, I sat on my porch as the summer warmth began to fade. A cool autumn breeze brushed against my skin, turning my thoughts toward the heavy burdens of aging. When we are young and strong, society praises our utility, but as we grow old, people only focus on our growing limitations. The grueling years in the middle, the endless overtime, the missed family holidays, and the quiet sacrifices always seem to get forgotten. I looked down at my scarred, arthritic hands, the permanent physical toll of a lifetime spent building, providing, and protecting. For decades, I believed my worth as a father was measured only by what I could financially provide. My trip to Hawaii taught me that growing old is not just about losing strength. It is about realizing where my responsibility ends. It did not take long before I decided to take a leap and join a local senior travel club, a step that would have seemed completely out of character for me just a few months prior. Suddenly, I was embarking on little day trips, shaking hands with strangers, and truly finding joy in my golden years. Imagine that. Actually enjoying retirement at 70. While my world was opening up, Brandon's was rapidly collapsing. His precious truck got sold, and whispers started circulating about his mounting debts. It is funny how fast the fair-weather friends vanish when the money dries up. Success brings a crowd, but hardship shows you who actually cares. Then, out of the blue, Emily called me. Her voice sounded incredibly fragile when she asked, "Dad, can we talk?" Hearing her voice on the phone like that, I finally recognized the little girl I had raised, rather than the defensive woman who had spent months demanding financial handouts. She sounded vulnerable, lost, and like she was finally starting to see the world clearly. We did not know it at the time, but that single conversation was about to reshape both of our futures. I knew her simple request to talk signaled a shift, but real transformation is never instantaneous. It takes time, and it usually only happens when life beats down the walls of our pride. We set a date for the following Saturday. When she offered to buy me lunch, I told her to come over to my place instead because I wanted to show her something. I was up before sunrise that morning, brewing a fresh pot of coffee and tidying up the house. I went straight to the hall closet and pulled down some heavy cardboard boxes that had been gathering dust for years. By the time my daughter knocked on the door, our old dining table was completely buried under stacks of photo albums. She stepped inside with a tense, tentative smile on her face, asking what all of this was about. I told her to take a seat, and she quietly slid into a chair, staring at the hundreds of faded, fragile memories spread out before us. Neither of us said a word for a long minute. I finally picked up an old picture of her at 6 years old, holding a massive fishing rod at Lake Erie, and she smiled. Confirming the memory, I handed her another photo from her 8th grade graduation, then one of her first car, and then her college orientation. Slowly, her soft smile faded, not out of sadness, but because she was starting to notice a quiet pattern in every single frame. There I was, standing right beside her, never trying to be the center of attention, but always present. She swallowed hard and asked if I had really kept all of these. I told her, of course I did, and then I reached deep into the box to pull out a thick stack of old receipts, tax papers, and bills. She looked confused, so I told her it was simply the paper trail of her life, handing her receipts for dance lessons from 20 years ago, medical bills, and old college tuition payments. My intention was never to make her feel guilty or to score some cheap point, but rather to reveal the hidden side of parenthood that children so rarely get to see. As parents, we spend decades carrying heavy financial and emotional burdens in total silence. We do not do it for applause or a gold star. We do it out of pure, unconditional love. But when sacrifice becomes completely invisible, it is so easy for people to take it for granted. Emily stared at the mountain of paperwork, her eyes filling with tears as she looked through the bills. When she whispered that she never knew, I just nodded. How could she have known kids do not see the skipped vacations, the extra shifts, or the personal dreams we put on hold? We go out of our way to make our kids feel safe, but that very security ends up hiding the true cost of what we give up for them. For nearly an hour, we sat side by side at that table, quietly sifting through the physical remnants of our past. There were no harsh words or wild accusations, just raw, unfiltered truth. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much, and Emily began to weep openly. I stayed quiet as she apologized, knowing she needed the space to release everything she had been holding inside. She wiped her eyes, whispering about the wedding, the money, and how terribly she had treated me. I just nodded slowly, telling her that most people do not realize the pain they cause until it is too late. Looking me dead in the eye for the first time in ages, she confessed that she had treated me like a bank account rather than her father. A heavy silence settled over the room, and though her words stung, they were the absolute truth. Once the air was cleared, she began opening up about the reality of her marriage, revealing that things with Brandon were far worse than I had ever suspected. He refused to take ownership of his life, blaming his boss, the economy, the landlord, and even me for his own shortcomings. As things got tougher, his accountability completely vanished. Emily told me they once fought for nearly 3 hours, not about their bank account, but about his refusal to step up and make a sacrifice. During that heated argument, a light bulb finally went off in her head as she recognized the exact same toxic pattern I had noticed back in Hawaii. He truly believed that the rest of the world existed solely to clean up his messes. Before long, their fragile living situation completely blew up. Emily later explained to me that Brandon had found out she was secretly meeting with me to talk heal and rebuild our relationship, and he absolutely lost his mind over it. That night, they had their worst fight yet. They screamed terrible, unforgivable things at one another, and Brandon packed a bag and walked out. He came back later, but the foundational trust, respect, and partnership in their marriage were gone for good. A few days went by, and then I spotted a handwritten envelope sitting in my mailbox with no return address. I knew immediately it was Emily's penmanship, and inside, I found a deeply personal, 4-page letter that I still keep tucked away safely in my desk drawer. She did not just apologize for the wedding disaster, she apologized for years of taking my support for granted. Out of everything she wrote, one sentence pierced my heart so deeply that I must have read it 20 times over. She wrote that I had spent decades ensuring she never felt alone, yet she had managed to make me feel entirely isolated anyway. It was a heavy realization, because she finally understood my quiet, unspoken loneliness. You and I can both understand how hard it is to watch your purpose slowly fade as you get older, feeling like you are only valued when someone needs a handout. Reading her words made me break down in tears, not out of sorrow, but from a profound sense of relief because I finally felt seen. Forgiveness would not happen overnight, since real life is not some movie where decades of pain vanish in a single afternoon. But a crucial shift had occurred, and the healing had begun because honesty had finally replaced the lies. When she called a few days later to ask if we would ever be okay again, I stared out the window deep in thought. The golden evening sun was slowly dipping below the horizon, casting a warm, patient glow over the quiet streets. I took a deep breath and told her that I believed we were finally starting to heal. Neither of us had a map for the journey ahead, but we were finally walking side by side again, and at this point in my life, that was more than enough. You and I both know how much can change in a single year if people are actually willing to learn from their mistakes. The 12 months following that wedding turned out to be the strangest period of my life, mostly because I was finally learning how to live for myself. It might sound selfish to a young person, but at 70, it is survival. I booked a scenic train ride through the mountains and joined several weekend excursions with my new social circle. It was wonderful making friends with folks who truly understood the quiet realities of aging, like the dull ache in your joints when a storm is rolling in, or the heavy silence of an empty house. We all shared that surreal experience of looking in the mirror and suddenly seeing our own parents looking back at us. I began to cherish my quiet mornings on the porch with a hot cup of coffee, watching baseball, and reading. For the first time since losing my wife, my entire existence did not revolve around managing someone else's chaos, and I felt incredibly free. Exactly 6 months after our breakthrough talk, Emily and Brandon's separation became permanent. We did not throw a party or celebrate. Divorce is never a triumph, but rather the final receipt for a long ledger of painful mistakes. My daughter downsized to a modest apartment, sold off her excess belongings, built a strict budget, and finally began living within her financial means. These adjustments were quiet and understated, but they represented true lasting growth. One warm evening, she came over to my house, and I grilled up some burgers in the backyard. Sitting there, she smiled, shook her head, and admitted she used to think I had everything figured out. I laughed and told her I had been winging it for 70 years. A sudden quiet stillness settled over her face as she looked up at me. She told me she thought she finally understood something, and I just waited. She said that when her mom died, I never let her see how difficult things actually were. It caught me off guard because she was right. I had buried everything, including the debts, the exhaustion, and the crushing isolation. Parents do that. We stand in the storm so our kids never feel the wind. Looking at her plate, she admitted she thought life was just easier than it is. I nodded softly. She whispered that she never understood what I sacrificed. We sat in silence, then I reached out, squeezed her hand, and asked if she understood now. She nodded, not perfectly, but enough. It turned out to be more than enough, and by the time the next spring rolled around, Emily invited me to a small family gathering. It was nothing fancy, just a simple barbecue at our local park with a handful of relatives and close friends. The moment I arrived, I noticed something that made my heart skip. There was an empty chair sitting right next to hers at the main picnic table, clearly reserved and waiting. She spotted me and waved me over, calling out, "Dad." As I walked toward her, she smiled and told me my seat was right there. A simple chair is such a minor detail, but as you and I both know, respect often lives in these tiny moments. Just 1 year ago, I was excluded from her wedding. Now, she was saving a place for me. She did not ask me there because she needed money or wanted my help. She simply wanted me to be part of her day. That distinction meant the absolute world to me. Later that afternoon, she stood up to make a brief, informal toast. I will carry the words she spoke with me for the rest of my days. She raised her glass, looked straight into my eyes, and said that when she was younger, she thought love was just something people said. The entire park went completely silent. Then she said that now she understands love is actually what people do. My throat tightened as she thanked me for never giving up on her, even when she made it so hard. I had to look away as the tears welled up in my own eyes. It can actually be much harder to receive deep gratitude than criticism, particularly when you have spent years waiting to hear those words. As the afternoon went on, kids ran around playing and laughter filled the air, while the sun slowly dipped lower in the sky. Sitting there, watching Emily chat with our relatives, a profound truth dawned on me. For months, I had mistakenly believed this whole situation was about getting even, but it was never about revenge. The wedding debacle, the unpaid rent, the endless arguments, they were just the surface. The real story was about boundaries and dignity. I finally realized that love and obligation are not the same. Sometimes stepping back is the most loving choice. There are times when we must let people face the consequences of their actions before they can truly appreciate what they have. It was life that taught Emily that hard lesson, not me. And honestly, life is a much better teacher than anger. Looking back at everything, I realize I do not hold any hatred for Brandon. I do not wish him any ill will. His own choices shaped his path, just like mine shaped mine. That is how true justice works, not through bitter revenge or harsh punishments, but through quiet, patient, and unavoidable consequences. Emily and I still do not have a perfect bond, but it is real and honest. I learned to never measure my self-worth by how useful I am to others. I had to learn that my true value does not come from what I can provide to others, but simply from who I am. If someone only notices you when they want something, their blindness is the real issue. Now when I look at my daughter, I no longer see the girl who left me out of her wedding. I see a woman who learned, grew, and found her way home. Honestly, that is all a parent can hope for. If you and I can take away one thing from this, let us think of those who quietly sacrificed for us. Tell them what they mean to you before regret becomes your teacher. If you have ever had to choose between resentment and healing, I would love to hear your story. Thank you for listening, and take care of each other.